let me get started in the interest of getting through our 2 hours expeditiously. Okay, so tonight we're very happy. So by the way, next week it's going to be upstairs again, and for the next 7 weeks, or what's go on, 6 weeks it'll be upstairs again. So it's only this one time it's downstairs, but. So Animal Rights Academy is happy that Camille Labchuk agreed to speak with us here today, which is great. She's a lot of you know her as a very prominent animal rights activist and lawyer. Camille and Anna Pippis were here as law students 7 years ago when I was a graduate student as well, and I remember them doing a lot of great activism for animals at the time. I was very impressed. Anna went on to join MFA Canada, and Camille ended up, among many other things, running for the Green Party of Ontario, federal, and doing a great job and getting a lot of votes and bringing up the animal issue as she did so. And more recently, she's represented 7 people in the November 6th civil disobedience case, and had a complete and total legal victory, which is amazing. And so that's extremely impressive. She's part of Animal Justice Canada, which is doing a lot of great law reform work for animal rights and welfare. And she's involved in many other things that I'm not even aware of that are great too.
That's a good catch-all.
And on top of that, she's a great person. So we're very happy that she's here to share her knowledge and about the talk is on. Normally, when we have lawyers, the talk is on animal rights and the law. Today, as far as I understand, the talk is about where the political parties in Canada stand on the question of animal rights and welfare, which is actually a great topic because a lot of us don't actually know that. And so we're going to get a good education here tonight, including me. I'm happy to see such a great turnout. I just want to quickly acknowledge that all of these talks this year in 2015 thus far have been organized by Victoria Lyon, who's unable to make it tonight, but she's doing a great job, so hope you all can continue to come out and support what she's doing. And thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you for speaking with us. We're going to go for roughly an hour, and then we either have a chance to just go jump into discussion, or we can take a 10-minute break and then have a discussion. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. I'm really excited to be here talking about something other than animal law for change. It's my passion and it's what I do and I love it, but I've given the animal law talk so many times that I've been in my state. So it was actually really enjoyable for me to work on something that's a little bit different for a change. So as Paul mentioned, I've run for the Green Party in the past. My background in politics extends a little bit farther beyond that, though. Before going to law school, I worked for many years as Elizabeth May's secretary, and press secretary rather, in Ottawa, leader of the federal Green Party. And I worked on her leadership campaign as well. And before that was my first run for parliament back in 2006 when I was always 21 years old. So this is something I've been passionate about for a number of years. And what drew me into politics, even though I ran for the Green Party and I always supported the Green Party, it wasn't the environment. I cared deeply about the environment, but my issue has always been animal rights. And the reason I got involved in politics, and the Green Party in particular, is because that's the party with the strongest stance on animal rights. So that's my disclaimer. You all know where I stand politically, so please take what I say with a grain of salt, because I'm sort of biased towards one party. But for good reason, as I think I'll show you. So we're going to talk about a few things tonight. I'm going to start off with a broad overview of how political ideology fits in with the idea of concern for animals. So is animal rights a left-wing issue? Is it a right-wing issue? Is it nobody's issue in particular? And we're going to get into Canada's main political parties right now and talk a little bit about each of them in sort of a summary way. And then delve into a little bit more when it comes to their stances on animal issues. And I'm going to use a few examples, 3 particular ones, to illustrate some of the differences and some of the contradictions within them. I'm going to start with the criminal code, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important later, but suffice to say there have been various attempts to amend the code over the years to protect animals better. And the debates and the attempts to do so really reveal a lot about the political divide in Canada on animal issues. Then I'm going to talk about the seal hunt, which I think delves even deeper into the issues, and it's a really fascinating case study. And finally, something that came up a little bit more recently is the RCMP's decision and then forced retraction of the decision to abandon muskrat for HAPs for its officers. And spoiler alert, does it all come down to votes? The conclusion is basically Alright, so animals are one of those rare issues where conservatives and liberals, and I use that in the sense of a small c conservative and a small L liberal, but if you have parties situated on the spectrum, people at both the right and the left sides of the spectrum often agree on animal issues. So they can transcend the political divide, and this quote I've got up here, there's nothing partisan about compassion. That's just something that I pulled from, I think it was a PETA website, but I think it really shows something. There's, the quality for compassion is within each of us and doesn't necessarily hinge on one's political right-wing or left-wing views. So on the right-wing side, there are many pro-life conservatives who really respect animals and really find that that fits in very strongly with their concern for all life, and that can be very important to them. One prominent conservative, a Republican actually in the States, named Matthew Scully, wrote a book called Dominion that some of you may have read or heard about. And that really laid out the case, and his audience was with other conservatives and right-wingers and Republicans, so that really laid out the case that they too should care about animals. He had the idea that we have dominion over animals and that it's our responsibility to protect them. So it kind of goes along with the conservative philosophy that father knows best. It really has some deep religion origins. But nonetheless, it's there. It's something that animal advocates can use to help get better policies for animals, and it's important that we acknowledge it. And equally on the left-wing side of things, sometimes I think it's overly simplistic to talk about left-wing and right-wing, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. But there has typically, at least in Canada, been a concern for rights on the left side of the spectrum, a compassion for others, and a concern that social justice goals be met. So let's talk about Canada. We've got some logos up there, 5 political parties who are currently represented in the House of Commons. We've got the NDP, the Greens, the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the Bloc Québécois. I almost hesitate to leave the Bloc up there because I think they have 2 official seats now, and they're basically just collapsing. I can't picture them being much of a concern in the coming federal election, but they are represented, so they're up there. And I'm going to talk about some of their history on these issues too. So, where do they fall on the spectrum? If we think of the traditional right-wing versus left-wing spectrum, where do these parties fall? And like I just said, I think that's a bit of an overly simplistic way to look at things. Sometimes it's not so simple as it's just placing somebody's views on a simple spectrum with one end and another end. I think things are oftentimes more complex, but I think I've done a reasonable job of trying to evaluate where the parties stand. So assuming this is the center, everything over here is on the left, everything over here is on the right. What I've kind of done here is put the NDP pretty firmly on the left, and I think they themselves would agree quite strongly with that characterization, and they're very proud of that place on the spectrum. Conservatives, obviously, quite far right. Liberals like to cloak themselves in the language of left-wingers and rights and social justice, but when it comes down to it, most of their governments have been centrist at best and somewhat neo-liberal at times. So I put them a little bit right of center, but it depends on the leader, and that's subject to change. The Green Party, I think, is a bit more difficult to categorize. I'd say the Green Party is mostly centrist, probably a little bit left of center, because the Green Party does favor interventionist approaches to ensure rights are protected and people are protected. But I also think that the Green Party is sort of out in front other parties, and that's why I've tried to lift it up there. So if you look at this as a sort of a plane and a line on the spectrum, Green Party, I would say, is just sort of out in front in a sense. So where do the parties stand on animal issues? I've got an image here of a survey that WISPA, as it was then known, it used to be the World Society for the Protection of Animals, and they've since changed their name to World Animal Protection, which actually is WAF, so I don't know. I don't know how that's working out for them, but anyway, WISPA, as they were then known, in 2011 they sent an election time survey to the political parties, the 5 parties listed up there, and asked them for their views on various animal welfare issues. So here are some of the questions. There were 5 kind of main categories. And you can read them there. It's basically, do you support reforming criminal codes, animal cruelty provisions, and explain why it's a problem. The Universal Declaration on Animal Welfare, that's something that WISPA itself created and has been pushing internationally and has asked politicians to support, and it supports general principles on animal welfare. Animal transport laws in Canada are atrocious and really don't afford any protection to farmed animals, so they're supportive of changing those. And then what else would your party think? Do you have any other ideas about animal welfare? Are you thinking of other issues that we're not thinking of? What are your priorities? And finally, what does your leader think about animals, and what are his or her attitudes on these issues? So these are not radical questions. They're in theory the kind of things that anybody can say yes to. Of course we want to fix criminal code. Of course we want to fix animal transport. Of course we want animal welfare through some universal regulations. So they're pretty middle-of-the-road questions, not difficult questions, and in theory anyone can support them. So I'm going to talk about the party's answers to these questions because I think they illustrate a few principles. And I want to preface that by saying that this was 2011, we're now in 2015, so it's almost 4 years later. So things could have changed, and then parties take positions often based on the leader. The leader really sets the tone. And there's been leadership changes in a lot of those parties by now, so keep that in mind as well. I'm going to talk about some of those answers and some other sort of general points about where those parties have stood in the past. So the Green Party, spoiler alert, the Green Party I think probably has the strongest answers. There's very strong support in all of the answers for animal protection, including all of the points that WISPA hit on. And the Green Party also listed some some points that go pretty far above and beyond what the questionnaire was asking. And here's some quotes from the Green Party's responses. We advocate for reduced meat consumption, which is pretty significant when you think of it. And we'll go through the other parties' responses soon to show how different they are. The Green Party would implement a green tax on animal products produced by factory farms and address the widespread use of factory farming methods which involve systematic and routine cruelty to livestock. So again, that's a pretty big statement. It really cuts at the underpinnings of the factory farming food system. And we must stop seeing animals as mere tools, property, and profit, but as creatures that suffer and feel pain the same as we do. Which again is a statement that really cuts at the heart of the industrial animal system that we have right now. And Elizabeth May said personally that as leader of the Green Party, my personal commitment to animal welfare is expressed through support to shelters, adopting rescue animals, being vegetarian, and working to protect animal rights. And having worked for the lady for a number of years, I can tell you that she does all of those things, although she sometimes eats fish. But in general, I think this language is pretty reflective of what the Green Party stands for. As a party, it comments frequently on animal issues. For example, when Mercy for Animals does investigations, the Green Party will often put out a press release saying, hey, federal government, we need to fix this, we need to fix that. The party's policy document is called Vision Green, and it's kind of about 100 pages long. It's quite comprehensive and lists the party's policies on a whole bunch of points. There's an animal protection section in there, and it's pretty good. I wrote a lot of it. Elizabeth May wrote and introduced a bill to essentially ban the import of shark fin products into Canada. It wasn't quite a ban, but it was a labeling, country of origin and species of origin requirement that would regulate them out of business. So there's no way they'd be able to meet it, and they wouldn't be able to import. The Greens were the first party ever in Canadian history to appoint an animal protection critic, so a person whose job it was to watch for those issues as they came up in the media and criticize the government on them or look for other points to comment on publicly. And that's part of a shadow cabinet. There's a bunch of critics of various portfolios that the government would have in its actual cabinet. So it's pretty progressive. The Green Party's former deputy leader was animal rights activist and noted vegan Georges Larac, the former NHL player. And he brought quite a lot of credibility on that front, I think, to the party. He has a lot of passion and really internal drive to do good work for animals. The Greens are also the only party that's ever opposed the Canadian seal slaughter on Canada's east coast. That party was, or that policy rather, was passed at the convention in 2004 for the first time. And globally, the Greens are part of a global Green family. There's Greens in Europe, there's Greens in the States, there's Greens in Australia. Every continent around the world, there's Green parties. In many countries, especially where they have good voting systems, unlike Canada, Greens are elected and they're doing good things. Just this week or a few days ago, Greens in New South Wales, where there's currently an election underway, they released a very comprehensive animal protection policy calling for a 15% animal welfare office, which is something that no one else is willing to talk about. So next, I think after the Greens, the New Democrats had pretty good answers too, frankly. If you look at what they're saying, there's a very clear commitment to criminal code reform, the Universal Declaration on Animal Welfare, and animal transport reform. And I pulled out some quotes there that show that they, at least in words, take these issues pretty seriously. So the abuse of any vulnerable creature, human or otherwise, is something that we should take extremely seriously. And they repeatedly reference some work by their MPs, particularly one MP from British Columbia called Alex Adamanenko, who's done very good work on horse slaughter issues and transport issues, and I know personally really does care about animals. And then Jack Layton, of course, provided the quote there for himself that you can read, but he says that he takes the abuse of any vulnerable creature very seriously and will continue to work to protect animals. So I think at least they're saying the right things. We'll see later maybe that their actions don't always add up, but the words are at least a start. The NDP also briefly appointed an animal welfare critic for a period of time. Her name was Isabelle Morin, and she was a Montreal MP, is a Montreal MP. They removed her not too long after they appointed her in circumstances that I have never really been able to make clear, but I'll talk about that in a second. Their MPs have introduced bills on various issues, including lots of anti-cruelty bills, none of which have been passed yet, but it's nice that they're trying. Shark fin import, horse slaughter, shock collars for dogs. Some of their individual MPs do oppose the seal slaughter, even if it's party policy that the seal slaughter is A-OK. Unfortunately, in the NDP policy book, which is on their website, there's not a single hit for the word animal. So in the agriculture section, even that term, any reference to animals or their welfare, just doesn't make it onto the radar. So there's some good there, but there's also, I would say, a fair degree of internal divisiveness on animal issues. And I think this is accounted for by two different factors. So first of all, most of their MPs are from Quebec. Quebec, as many of you know, is not the most progressive province when it comes to animal welfare, which is sort of puzzling in a sense because they're fairly progressive on social issues and other issues. And Quebec has an excellent healthcare system, a daycare system. They're doing above and beyond what most of the rest of Canada is doing in many ways, but not on animal issues. So there's this, there's a foie gras in Quebec, the horse meat slaughterhouses are in Quebec. So there's this sense among the Quebec MPs that doing stuff very publicly on animal issues would be bad for them and their future electoral chances. So I think that's one source of tension. There's also an agriculture critic within the party named Malcolm Allen, who I've heard tales of. He's not interested in animal issues, except to the extent that he thinks industries, especially agriculture, should be permitted to exploit animals physically. And one example of what I hear is that he had a pretty strong influence on this botched anti-cruelty bill that the then animal welfare critic put forward. So she, from what I understood, really wanted to do something good, come up with a really strong bill, even stronger than what people have been proposing before. She did some outreach, and she actually reached out to Animal Justice and MFA and other groups I've been involved with, and got some recommendations. As it turned out, she introduced something that basically said, okay, we have to stop all this cruelty, but industries like farming and hunting and rodeos are all exempt. So there was like just a broad-scale exemption for all of these industrial activities that use the most animals in Canada. So it basically doesn't really protect any animals at all. So all the animal groups saw this bill and they're like, this is not right, what's going on? NDP, what are you doing? Like, why are you putting this forward? We were working with you in good faith. And the only response that seemed to make any sense is that despite her legitimate desire to do something good, she was deeply influenced by the agriculture critic who didn't want to do something good. So there is internal divisiveness within the NDP. Some MPs are very on board and want to do great work, and others not so much. Moving to the Liberals. This is the time Justin Trudeau killed an entire family of coyotes with his Christmas photo. This is actually a photo from 2010. It did actually go out on his Christmas card and provoked a fair degree of outrage among activists and the general public. I heard a lot about it at the time. So, I've put their entire answer to this question into the slideshow to illustrate a point. Okay, so does your party support strengthening the criminal code provisions? Liberal Party does support strengthening. All options linking animal cruelty and crime should be examined, bold and direct, taking into account the positions of all interested parties. We also believe that the legal treatment of animals, such as practices used in the farming community and fishers, should be protected. Any changes need to balance the humane treatment of animals and the legitimate practices of farmers, hunters, and sport fishers. So they're sort of saying something reasonable in the first sentence, but then they're qualifying that by saying, yeah, but we don't really take that seriously because we're more concerned with farmers, hunters, and sport fishers. So, I see this as extremely weak. It's basically pandering to both sides and not making anyone happy, which is not a good political position to be in. And really not helpful at all for the animals. And again, when they're asked about transport, any new amendment should balance humane transport with legitimate practices of the law-abiding farming community. So, Michael Ignatieff, I respect the dignity of all living creatures. Blah, 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 work with stakeholders, while balancing with the legitimate practices of farmers, hunters, and sport fishers. Alright, so that gives you kind of a peek at what they were thinking in that election. And who knows, it was 2011. Maybe they were concerned about trying to pick up rural seats and stop Stephen Harper and win some of those seats back, so that could account for it, but whatever it is, I don't really like it. History of the Liberal Party and animal issues. In 1998, to their credit, the Liberal Party did introduce the very first anti-cruelty bill that was designed to fix some of the pretty serious loopholes in the criminal code that protects animals. And they introduced follow-up bills by several other MPs. They've been continuing to push that issue since then. There's always a Liberal MP or two with an anti-cruelty bill out there. But on the flip side of that, the reason none of these bills have passed in the first place is because the formerly Liberal-dominated Senate obstructed a lot of them. So you've got the House of Commons trying to do something progressive, sort of, and then the Liberal Senate actively obstructing at every step of the way and pandering to industry and stopping any of these changes to protect animals from going through. So again, hugely divisive within the party. Then you've got Liberal Senator Mac Harb, who was the first elected, actually he wasn't elected, he was appointed, Canadian politician in history in Parliament to introduce a bill to end the seal hunt. Also some Liberal MPs individually, not really publicly, but they do oppose sealing, and they tend to be ones not from the East Coast where the kill is conducted, but from urban areas and BC. And again, there's no hits for animal on the Liberal Party's website, so they don't have policies on animals. The Conservative Party, this guy probably cares about animals, right? Look, he's cuddling a kitten. So despite what the image might project, you might be surprised to hear that Stephen Harper doesn't care about animals. Here's the Conservative Party's, here's the Conservative Party's response to the survey. They didn't bother to send it back. They couldn't even be bothered to try to reach out to these voters who might want to learn more about them, and they couldn't even be bothered to try to spin them a little at all. They just don't even care. So what we've seen recently, and let me backtrack a little bit. What are you laughing at?
What you read.
So backtracking a little bit, the current iteration of the Conservative Party is a new invention. The current Conservative Party formed in 2003 out of an amalgamation of the former PC Party, the Progressive Conservatives, which had been run by Brian Mulroney, Diefenbaker, Joe Clark. A pretty long tradition of success in Canada, although they never really beat up the Liberals for most time as Prime Minister. But that party merged with what was essentially the Reform Party, and the party has since become basically the Reform Party. It's not the Progressive Conservative Party that it once was. That party did have some okay positions on animal issues, and some of its MPs were not bad. The current Conservative Party is, frankly atrocious. So there's consistent smears towards animal advocates, including on the floor of the House of Commons, and including by name towards individual advocates. They opposed and blocked recently, this was, I guess, just about 2 years ago in 2013, a bill that an NDP MP had put forward to ban the importation of shark fin, full stop. And the Conservatives weren't whipped on that vote, so if you don't know political talk, that means that their party wasn't telling them how they had to vote. They were allowed basically to vote their conscience, and there was no one coming down from them up high, which is atypical because a lot of votes these days are what we call whip. So even though no one was whipping them, not enough Conservatives would vote for that legislation to help it pass, and only, I think, 6 needed to. The way the parties kind of are structured right now in the House of Commons is that the Conservatives have 163 MPs or something in that area. The Liberals have in the 30s, the NDP have about 100, and there's a few Greens and independents. So, and there's a 308 complement of MPs. So, 154 is what you need to pass a bill. And there weren't even enough Conservative MPs who would come forward to protect sharks that everybody agrees on are dying. They've gutted their Species at Risk Act recently. That was something that Harper introduced in the 2012 federal budget. That budget was pretty well known for gutting environmental legislation across the board. So everything that environmentalists have built up for 30 years in this country to protect animals and the environment, they did their best to undermine it at every step of the way. So they've made it more difficult for species to be protected. They've made not a single attempt since they've been in office, which has been since 2006, so it's 9 years now. We'll be closing on 10 by the time we see the back of them. They've made no effort to amend the criminal code, despite a very clear rationale for doing so. The only thing I think that they really introduced on animals is something called Quanto's Law. Has anyone heard of Quanto's Law? So in Edmonton a couple of years ago, a police dog named Quanto was stabbed by a guy who was fleeing from the police. This drug-addled, sort of mentally distressed guy who was fleeing from the police, and he stabbed Quanto, and Quanto died. So the Conservative government's like, law enforcement, we like that. We don't really like animals, but if we can get some animal people to vote for us by talking about law enforcement, we can do that. So they've introduced what's essentially a redundant bill. They're calling it Quanto's Law. And it makes it an offense to kill a law enforcement animal, so a police dog or a horse. Only dogs and horses. Maybe they say other animals, but it's really just dogs and horses that are used. It's already an offense to kill those animals. They're just making it an extra offense, I guess. And they've increased the penalty available for somebody found guilty of that offense. It's a completely meaningless law. It protects a very small number of animals, and it doesn't protect them any more than they already were protected. So, really cynical. I'm not a fan.
It protects the animals that they're using to protect their own anti-animal regime.
It's great. It's a great way of looking at it. The animals that they use in service. And then finally, the Conservatives actually have their own hunting and angling caucus within their 160-some MPs. There's about 30, 35 MPs who are members of this hunting and angling caucus who meet regularly to talk about ways that they can harm more animals. Alright, so I'm going to move on and talk now about something a little bit more specific, and that's the history of anti-cruelty legislation and the various attempts to amend it in Canada over the last 20 years or so. So, some of you probably heard the various animal law talks that I give, or Leslie Biscoe gives, or other animal rights lawyers in Toronto give, and you will know, of course, that Canada's criminal code was written in 1892. provisions protecting animals that make it an offense to harm animals or cause them unnecessary suffering have not been meaningfully updated since then. So that was back slightly after Confederation, before women had the right to vote. We're still applying that law that we applied back then to animals. In 1998, the Justice Department produced a consultation paper. It was actually quite good, and it identified a number of loopholes within the criminal code, and it recommended ways to fix them. So here's a list of some of them. For starters, animal cruelty crimes are housed in Part 11 of the Criminal Code, which is willful and forbidden act in respect to certain property. So the code assumes right off the bat that they're property. Now, yeah, they are property under the law. We can move them under the property section of the code. That doesn't mean we're not going to still treat them as property. But it does signal something that's, I think, important. It signals that animals are mere property and they don't really have any rights that are beyond mere property. So it's kind of a weird place to put crimes against sentient beings. Second, there's no real definition of animal within the criminal code. It's very difficult to understand what animal even means, and in some cases, wild animals or stray animals might be excluded from the definition. It's not clear. Then when we come to the neglect provision, so there's two main offenses in the code. There's criminalization of causing unnecessary suffering, so actively causing unnecessary suffering. And then there's the willful neglect of animals that causes them to suffer. So what does willful neglect? How can you neglect something, which means like not pay any attention to it, but willfully not pay any attention to it? So actively try not to pay attention to it. It's a total oxymoron, and it's been a problem in terms of getting convictions under this section for decades. So the report recommended fixing that. As I mentioned, stray animals are not covered depending on the provision. Only owned animals that are people's property. The provisions protecting animals from fighting, so like cockfighting, for example, or dog fighting, are pretty weak and miss a lot of things like training animals to fight or living on the proceeds of animal fighting. And back in 1998, there was a maximum of 6 months in prison available for an offense to an animal. So it doesn't matter how depraved and cruel you might act toward an animal, the most you will be imprisoned for is 6 months. And to put that in context, it was pretty unusual for a crime of violence like a 6-month maximum sentence. It would typically be 2 years or more. This graph shows some of the various attempts over the year to fix the criminal code. So starting at the top here, 1999, that's Justice Minister Anne McClellan's first bill. She's a liberal, she's the Justice Minister, she gets this report and she says, okay, we're going to introduce a bill to fix these problems. So she puts that forward, result, it dies when the 2000 election is called. So next, 15B and 10B, these two probably came the closest to actually passing and getting through the House of Commons. But for various reasons, one of them died when the House was prorogued, which means that all the bills get wiped off the order paper. And then 10B, the Senate, the liberal-dominated Senate, stalled and meddled, and basically the bill died before they could fix it. And then over the years, you see more attempts, various things happen, they just don't make it long enough through the House to get passed. In 2005, a liberal senator starts introducing a bill that doesn't fix any of the substantive problems with the criminal code, it just makes the sentences longer. So that's really appealing to animal use industries that don't care about animals, but don't care about the sentence either. They're like, oh, fine, as long as we don't do anything to really protect animals, it doesn't matter if the sentence is longer. So he's got these bills, eventually another liberal MP starts introducing some. This one, S208, I'm going to talk about it in more detail. And there have been 12 bills, about a dozen bills since 2008. It's hard to keep track of them because they keep getting reintroduced under different names. But about that many from Liberal and NDP MPs. And they're either sitting there still right now, I think there's probably 5 of them sitting there right now, and some of them have died. Alright, so C15B, that's one of the ones that I mentioned. What year was that one? Oh yeah, so, oops. 15B, right, so that was 2001. So this was the first attempt that made it pretty far. There were 40,000 letters at least sent in supporting this bill from Canadians. I've spoken with parliamentarians who were around at that time, and they say that they never received anything like the volume of support they got from constituents and the public for anti-cruelty legislation. No other issue in their time as parliamentarians touched people in the same way. So there was enormous public support for this, and it was a huge issue at the time. Some of you probably remember. There was also a recent case of Jesse Powers right here in Toronto that some of you may remember as the Kensington Market cat killer. He videotaped himself killing a cat. He was from Kensington Market, so hence the name. He basically tortured this cat to death and said it was part of an art film project. He's trying to illustrate the discrepancies between how we treat food animals, because he tortured a chicken earlier, and how we treat domestic animals like cats. That was a huge issue in Toronto, really high profile. He ended up getting a really light sentence, a slap on the wrist, like basically weekends in jail. And the court, for various reasons, just wasn't in a position to do much more because the legislation was so weak. So that really catalyzed a lot of support for these amendments. And let me talk for a second about what the bill really proposed. It was not a radical shift in the way we view animals. It still views animals as some sort of property, despite them being removed from the explicit property section of the code. It was not designed to give rights to animals. It was not a challenge to industrial animal use. There was no fundamental change. The NDP even endorsed the bill as a welfarist approach that would not threaten legitimate commercial use. So it really wasn't a paradigm shift, but all it did was fix some of the loopholes involved in specific cases so that prosecutors and police could actually go after people effectively who legitimately abused animals for sadistic purposes. That's all the criminal code is really there for. It's to tackle people who are basically sadists and abuse animals because they're sadistic. It's not there to protect animals from industrial cruelty, and that's likely never what it's going to be used for. So this bill did not threaten or challenge any of that. It was supported broadly by the animal protection community, by police associations, by veterinarian associations across the country. And it was opposed, of course, by every animal use industry that felt like putting out a press release. So there's a list there, but anyone you can think of essentially is on record opposing these changes. So during this process, with 15B and 10B, there were some really interesting hearings and debates. So the bill went to the Justice Committee, which studies it and hears testimony from witnesses, and MPs on that committee, their job is to get more information about the bill, look at issues, see if there's any amendments that they would suggest, see if there's any ways to make the bill better, and then send it back to the House of Commons to move it through the legislative process. So they had a number of witnesses testify. There were people from the animal protection community, there were people from animal use industries, and they all had an opportunity to say their piece. What's really interesting, if you go back and look at the Justice Committee transcripts and the debates in Hansard, which is the official record of the House of Commons, so the parliamentary debates where MPs say what they think about this bill, there's some really clear themes that emerge. And these themes we see particularly with the Progressive Conservative, Bloc Québécois, and Canadian Alliance MPs, especially the Canadian Alliance ones, frankly, which is the newest version of the reform, which then turned into the Conservative Party. So that's who represents us today in Parliament for the Conservatives, is Canadian Alliance people, basically. So a few themes from those guys. Fear that the amendments will humanize animals, that it will lead to a slippery slope where we start treating animals like people, and giving them human rights. Fear that the amendments would criminalize what they think are legitimate industries like fishing and hunting and farming and trapping and research and all of the industrial ways that we use animals in society. And they had specific concerns as well. They brought repeatedly examples up like branding or dehorning cattle. Is that going to be illegal? Anglers being charged for various practices around baiting fish, and things like Jewish ritual slaughter of animals. And they also raised a repeated concern about something that they call nuisance prosecution. I don't really know what that means, but I guess it would refer to a prosecution of somebody involved in an industrial animal activity. So that was what we would call the right wing, basically. And the Bloc, I wouldn't put them on the right of the spectrum at all. They're quite left wing, but they're also from Quebec, so they've got that sort of underlying concern about or skepticism of animal protection groups. But the Liberals and the NDP, They were much better, not universally. The NDP was pretty good, the Liberals were pretty good because it was their bill after all, but there were still some MPs who expressed skepticism. But they repeatedly emphasized the public outcry over these high-profile cruelty cases, and the link between animal abuse and human abuse, which is well publicized and well known by now. And they emphasized that the law must start treating animals like sentient beings instead of simply property. So I pulled out a few interesting choice quotes here from some of the now conservative MPs. This guy named Inky Merrick really hated these bills. He was just on a rampage. So what it illustrates to me is the divide between urban Canada and rural Canada. So he says, as you know, urban residents tend to relate to animals as pets, whereas rural Canadians tend to relate to animals as a livelihood. And he's from a rural riding. Kevin Sorensen is an MP from Alberta. My dog's my dog. I bought my dog and raised my dog. I castrated my dog. When I go to the other farm and leave my dog there, my dog comes home because he knows my dog, he's my property. And he continues on. When I go home to the ranch, we have some practices there that would be deemed cruelty to animals, I'm sure, by you, Ms. Bisgold. He was actually talking to Leslie Bisgold at this point, because she was testifying at the committee this day. Some of the practices that farming, ranching, all types of farming carry out would be deemed cruelty to animals. They're my riding, they're essential. He acknowledges that the practices that he's engaged with, that his community's engaged with, are cruel practices, but they're essential. So it goes back to the fundamental debate about what is necessary. Gerald Keddy, he's a Nova Scotia MP, who's pretty bad too. He says the legislation would place fishermen, farmers, hunters, trappers, and all those liberals, pejorative, who want to boil a lobster at risk. Forget the people who actually make a living in this country by raising livestock. And Vic Taves, who went on to be Justice Minister and was recently appointed as a judge in Manitoba by the Harper government, I can't support this bill because my constituents' livelihoods are at risk here and I can't afford that on their behalf. So, frankly, this is all overstating the case with just an unprecedented degree of hyperbole. I wish that the bill went that far, and I wish that it posed a fundamental threat to animal use industries. It did not. There was nothing in there at all that would cause any problems for anyone wanting to use animals in an industrial context. It would simply fix those cases that can't be prosecuted right now, where someone has sadistically abused an animal, and that's something everybody agrees on. But industry was, very opposed to this. They viewed it as a slippery slope, and these MPs adopted industry's concerns. So just looking back here at our graph showing where these bills went, I'm going to move on to back up. Right, so 15B went to hearings. A lot of the quotes that I was just speaking about were pulled out from hearings on 15B. Eventually it died, but they reintroduced it as 10B. So again, 10B went through the House of Commons. It passed pretty easily, and it finally went to this place. Who knows what that is? Senate. The place where good legislation goes to die. So 10B eventually made its way to a Senate committee, the Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs. And they recommended some pretty significant and pretty bad changes to Bill C-10. They recommended changing the definition of animal to include only non-human vertebrates, deleting any other animal with the capacity to feel pain. So the drafters of the bill wanted to make sure that anyone who could feel pain was protected against pain. And that included things like lobsters and invertebrates that, like octopi, for example, that could potentially feel pain. And that, of course, would be evaluated on the basis of veterinary evidence, not by people sitting in the House of Commons. So they didn't like that. They were concerned that boiling lobsters would then become a criminal offense. So they wanted to change that. They wanted to add something called the color of right defense, which is sort of complicated and I won't get into, but it's a potential defense against various criminal charges. And finally, they wanted to explicitly yet redundantly recognize Aboriginal rights to do whatever they want to animals. Aboriginal rights are already protected in Canada's Constitution. Putting it into a criminal cruelty bill is redundant, and you can't exempt a certain class of people from the criminal code. You just can't do that. So they sent it back to the Liberal-dominated Senate after that. The Senate sent it back to the House of Commons. House of Commons is kind of not too happy about this because they're like, hey, we put a lot of thought into this bill. Why are you changing these things in a really unfortunate way? But the Liberals did accept the animal definition change as kind of a concession. And I guess, after that it died and it didn't actually go anywhere and get passed. But it was the Liberals who put forward the bill in the first place, the Justice Minister, but it was the Senate that essentially messed with it and killed it. Finally, Bill S-203. So this is the bill that finally did pass. This is the only one of those bills that ever did pass. And as I mentioned, the only thing that this bill did was increase the maximum penalty available for these crimes from 6 months to 2 years in prison. It didn't make any new offenses, it didn't substantively fix the legislation, it was supported by animal use industries, they were all on board, the farmers are like, yeah, bring this in, this is great. Of course, all the animal advocates opposed it because they knew exactly what would happen. Once it passed the House of Commons in 2008, supported by many Liberals, by the way, it killed any appetite for further reform of the criminal code. And nothing has been accomplished since then. All of these bills that they've been introducing are just kind of languishing there. Because everyone kind of thinks, oh yeah, animals, we dealt with that a few years ago, let's move on and do something else. So it just took the wind out of the sails, and that's exactly what the industry and what the senator who introduced it knew would happen. So it's really unfortunate. Alright, now we're going to talk about the seal hunt. So this example, I think, illustrates in greater depth what the parties really think about animal issues. So criminal code issues, anti-cruelty stuff, that's easy. Except for the conservatives who don't want to do anything at all or want to be seen like they're doing something without actually doing anything for animals. All the parties did support cruelty amendments, but the seal hunt parties, I think, really show their true colors on animal issues, and it's a bit more complex than criminal code stuff, which is something we can all support. So I used to work on the seal hunt. I worked for Humane Society International Canada before I went to law school, and I've been to the hunt to observe it, I guess 3 or 4 times, out on the ice floes and helicopters and little Zodiac boats zipping around. So I've got a fair amount of experience with this. And I also followed the debates quite closely. Seal hunts in Canada. There are 2 seal hunts in Canada, and a lot of people don't really realize this, but there's the East Coast Commercial Seal Hunt, which we all think of as a seal slaughter. It's conducted by white men, most of whom are from Newfoundland. It is a hunt for one thing, for baby seals, baby harp seals. 97% of the seals killed are less than 3 months old when they're killed. Hundreds of thousands of them are slaughtered or can be slaughtered every year. There's really extreme animal welfare issues, as we all know. Veterinarians who study the carcasses of skinned seals in many cases conclude that there isn't sufficient cranial fracture from the clubbing of those seals to ensure that they were alive when they were skinned. Very, very substantial issues. Worker safety is an issue as well. The seal hunt on the East Coast happens in an area essentially the size of France, on ice floes that are shifting in rough seas and high winds. So workers who are jumping off of boats onto slippery ice floes, potentially falling in the water, potentially injuring themselves in all kinds of ways. And, it's well documented that sailors die. Pretty much every year there's a serious accident or a death, including boats capsizing. Back 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, they used to lose entire boats and dozens of men at a time. And of course, in terms of environmental conservation, it's taking a huge bite out of the harp seal population on the East Coast. It's also very heavily subsidized by the Canadian government. The subsidies come in the form of subsidies for the purchase of the fur, so the purchase of the products. There's subsidies given less directly through Coast Guard use, so a use of Coast Guard icebreakers to help break the path through the ice floes for sealers to get to the seals. So of course the ice is packed solid many years, and they won't be able to get in there without the use of the Coast Guard icebreakers, and those ships cost thousands of dollars to run. There's the cost of enforcement, which requires those icebreakers as well, and helicopters, and just a lot of human power to enforce it. And that's just a tip of the iceberg, really, on the subsidies. The other seal hunt, it's not really an organized seal hunt at all, but there's First Nations subsistence sealing, primarily in Canada's north, mostly by Inuit. Very small numbers of seals are killed, about 1,000 a year or sometimes less. They're different seal species, they're not the harp seals, and it's a subsistence hunt. They wear the fur, they eat the meat. They're not skinning seals to sell the fur exclusively into the commercial fur trade. Very different. So brief history of commercial sealing in Canada. 1700s, it was conducted off the coast of Newfoundland, mostly within walking distance of the shore. 1800s, they started to use vessels to leave the shore and go searching for seals. And some of those vessels eventually became steam-powered, so it enhanced their capacity to kill all of these seals. About 33 million seals were killed in the 19th century. In the 1950s, that's when observers first began to attend. And then in 65, international outcry began after a short film was made. And that was sort of the genesis of the modern anti-sealing movement. IFAW, the International Fund for Animal Welfare, was established in 1969 in New Brunswick to fight against the seal hunt and to attempt to stop it. And Greenpeace campaigned heavily on those issues after its founding in 1976 and went out to the ice floes many times to disrupt the seal hunt. In 1983, the European Union, in response to pressure from animal advocates, actually banned the importation of white coat fur from seals. And backing up a little, it used to be the cute, fluffy white seals that they killed. That was what the market wanted, that was what was profitable, so that was the target of the kill. Seals lose their cute, fluffy white fur after about 3 weeks. So after about 3 weeks. So once that market in the European Union sort of dried up, Canadian sealers began to kill fewer seals, and eventually in 1987, Canada implemented a ban on the sealing of white coats, and they thought that would respond to European Union concerns and revitalize the seal hunt. The seal hunt was kind of quiet for a while, but after 1992, the collapse of the cod stocks and the cod fishery and the ending of that, sealers began to say, it's the seals that are killing all the cod, we need to start killing them again, which is completely not based on a shred of evidence. In fact, the opposite is likely true. But the government started heavily subsidizing the seal hunt again, even though there was a pretty, like a relative lull after the European Union passed its ban, until about 1995. So in 1995, they started subsidizing the ban again. And now they're killing the seals who have lost their white coat. So they're, 3 weeks plus of age, between 3 weeks and 3 months. They don't have the white fur anymore, but they're still babies. But that's what the market supports now. So subsidies start going up again. And as the late 90s rolled around, over 250,000 seals are being slaughtered every year as per the quota that the government would set. So 2002, the quota was set at 275,000, and even though sealers slaughtered 312, there were no prosecutions for exceeding the quota. And the quota just kept going up. It went up to 350,000. It just started getting out of control. It was spiraling out of control. They were killing more and more seals every year. And again, in the EU, pressure began to mount, and animal advocates and citizens from across Europe were just outraged when they saw images of the seal hunt. In response to that, and the great work of many people over there, the EU banned seal products again in 2009, so not just white coat seal products this time. Despite this and the subsequent market plummeting that was kind of seen, so between 2009 and present, only about 54,000 to 90,000 seals were slaughtered, which is still a lot, but a far cry from the several hundreds of thousands that were being slaughtered before. But despite this, the government still set the quota at 400,000 a year, which is just, again, insane. So, political support for the sealing industry. Every single party in the House of Commons, except for the Green Party, supports sealing. In fact, it's not just that they support sealing and have never done anything to stop it. It's that they actually climb all over each other and fall over one another to see who can support the seal hunt more. It's like this game that the Conservatives and the Liberals used to play with who can support the troops more. You support the troops, no. Or you don't support the troops, no, you don't support the troops. They even entertain Seal Day on Parliament Hill, which is basically an annual thing now where the sealing industry comes to the hill and starts trying to give people seal meat, which, like, by the way, apparently is disgusting. Nobody wants to eat it. Parliamentary dining room served it at one point. Nobody was ordering it, so it came off the menu right away. Like, it's not even an appetizing product as far as meat products go. And sealing opponents are attacked by politicians of all parties by names. They don't even try to hide it. So it's not just that they support the seal hunt, it's that it's a very high degree of animosity towards those who are working to end it, and it's become so politicized that you can't speak about these issues with parties publicly. So this is a picture of then Fisheries Minister Keith Ashfield getting pinned with a seal fur lapel by this guy who's, I think that's Frank Pinhorn, who's Executive Director of the Sealing Association. This is Justin Trudeau wearing a seal lapel pin. Michael Ignatieff is eating seal meat. Mark Garneau, the astronaut, is wearing a pin. So is Thomas Mulcair. So what is all of this about? Why do they all support the seal hunt? Most Canadians don't. Polls consistently show that upwards of 60% of us oppose sealing and the seal kill. So why do politicians support it if we don't? And the answer is right here. It's all about Newfoundland. Newfoundland has 7 seats in the House of Commons, and all of the parties want those seats. This is a list right now of MPs in Newfoundland, the names of the ridings here and their seats, their names, and then their affiliations over there. So it's a combination of Liberals and NDP MPs right now, but before the 2011 election there were Conservatives in there. So all parties think that they've got a shot at winning those seats, and they know that if they don't support the seal hunt, they don't have a shot at winning those seats. And in this sort of fragmented, hyper-partisan parliament, where every seat counts towards potentially getting your majority or minority or whatnot, they are falling all over themselves as they have for decades to support this cruel kill.
Nobody's buying them anymore. Banned everywhere.
Yeah, banned everywhere. Nobody in Canada wears seal products, and they have to dye seal products now to try to convince people that there's something else. Like, you should see what they make out of seal skin now. It's not even recognizable as seal. It's just, random fur.
I don't know if you saw Don Cherry just ate some seal meat and the other guy attacked him on the plane, said he's a barbarian.
Oh yeah, that was funny.
Yeah.
That was funny.
Who was buying it then?
We'll do it.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, they're trying to open markets in China.
Okay.
And they failed miserably at that so far. They've been trying to do that since the 80s, is what they're saying. So they're always sending someone over there on a trade mission. And it's not working because nobody's interested. And they're always trying to sell new seal products like seal oil, which again, nobody wants. Seal heart valves. Every year they come out with a new story that says, oh yeah, seal heart valves are going to be a great human replacement for human heart valves. It's going to be great. We're going to monetize the rest of the body that we just leave on the ice floes right now after we rip off the fur. And it's not happening. Nobody wants seal fur, and nobody wants heart valves. So, over the years, the Liberals presided over the massive resurgence in the seal hunt in the 90s. Into the early 2000s. So they also presided over some pretty serious thefts of civil liberties when they introduced observation permits for the seal hunt, which is something that has sort of already existed, but they've tried to tighten it up. So if you would like to go watch the seal hunt now, well, first of all, you've got to rent a helicopter, so it's not easy to start with. But you also have to go through an RCMP DFO background check. You have to be issued a specific license to attend the seal hunt. You can't be within 1.5 miles of the seal hunt unless you have a license to be there. The license expires. It's a one-day only license. You have to renew it every day. It's just, I've gone through it. I've had these licenses issued. It's an incredibly complex process. And if you get a license to be in a helicopter to see it, then you can't later switch into a boat or they're going to ding you there. It's just basically as onerous as they could possibly make it. And groups have sued over this in the past and said it is a fundamental violation of our charter rights. And it is. But, unfortunately it's been upheld and things have kind of shifted around a bit, so it's not as bad as the Liberals tried to make it. So not only did they preside over this massive ramping up of the sealing industry, but they tried to steal people's liberties and tried to shut down observation as well. They held most Newfoundland seats during this time, of course. Liberal Senator Matt Hurd sort of went rogue and introduced a bill in 2009 to end the seal hunt in Senate. So that was interesting. Unfortunately for him, he didn't line up a seconder of the bill in advance, so when he stood up to table the bill, nobody would second it, so it couldn't move forward. Liberals are responsible for attacking seal-hunt opponents. They've named people in the House of Commons as enemies, basically, because they support doing good things for seals. One of their other senators, her name is Celine Erdu-Payette. She's kind of the chief attack dog of the Liberals on sealing. And I'll show you some quotes that she's got a little bit later. The Liberals recently supported some further conservative attempts to limit observation of seal hunting even more. And then, to be fair, some Liberal MPs individually do oppose sealing, oftentimes from Toronto or Ontario or from Montreal or Vancouver. So, when it comes to the Conservatives, they say, this is Peter McKay. This actually was a quote from the anti-cruelty committee hearings, but he threw this out there too, so I thought I'd throw it up here. He says, if baby seals looked like alligators or lizards, I don't think they would have been appearing on big billboards in Times Square. Let's keep this in perspective. Don't really have to worry about the seals. So interestingly, it was Mulrooney who actually ended white coat sealing in 1987. So there's a bit of a precedent there for Conservatives doing something around sealing. But of course, the Harper Conservatives fought the European Union seal ban tooth and nail, not just while it was going on. They had a fisheries ambassador, this dude named Loyola Hearn, whose job it was to go over there and lobby full time on the seal hunt in the European Parliament. And his budget was just insane, spending money on hotels and restaurants and travel, and it was getting a little excessive. So they spent millions on those lobbying efforts. And then they spent further millions appealing the EU decision to every appeal body available in international law. And they lost it every step of the way, and everybody knew that they would lose at every step of the way. Every legal expert that they consulted said, you are going to lose this case. But they did it for political reasons, because they wanted to be the ones to support the seal hunt the most. Greg Kerr, one of their MPs from West Nova in Nova Scotia, he recently introduced Bill C-555, which was an attempt to further limit sealing observers and keep them back a greater distance. And this actually seemed more tied to the gray seal hunt, which is another seal hunt that happens in the area, but it's, we won't get into it now, but there was that further attempt. And they frequently use Matt Harb as a political football, and they often try to hit the Liberals over the head with Matt Harb and say, oh, your senator introduced this bill, so you guys don't support the seal hunt enough, and Newfoundland shouldn't support you either. The NDP, traditionally, they've had no seats in Newfoundland. They only picked up their first Newfoundland seat in 2008. But despite that, they've been strong supporters of the seal hunt all along. The ousting of Rick Smith. This is an interesting story. When Jack Layton assumed the leadership in 2003 of the NDP, he selected a longtime New Democrat and longtime conservationist and environmentalist named Rick Smith as his chief of staff. So that's basically his right-hand man as an employee. Rick Smith's job, up until he went to work for Jack Layton, had been working as executive director of IFA. So he's the guy who's putting out those press releases saying, hey, we should stop the seal hunt, stop killing seals, stop it. The NDP in Newfoundland did not take well to Rick Smith getting this job. It's just a job as executive director. They launched a campaign consistently to undermine Jack Layton and undermine Rick Smith and essentially force Jack Layton to back down from this position and fire Rick Smith because he had done work to oppose the seal hunt. So that just shows the extent to which this issue is important to parties, even if they don't really stand a chance of picking up seats. So that was really appalling, frankly. I found it appalling. Recently, the NDP has attacked the Conservative government for not supporting sealing enough. MP Ryan Clary, he's a St. John's MP, he was attacked by the Conservatives in 2012 because he made a comment acknowledging that there's a problem with the seal hunt. It was just a simple acknowledgement that, yeah, sealing is kind of on its way out. We need to be starting to look at other markets, which is frankly not a statement for or against the seal hunt. It's just a statement of reality, and it's an objective truth that the seal hunt is getting smaller and quite rapidly. So he said this. And he was attacked left and right. It was crazy. There were editorials in the Newfoundland papers denouncing him. All the other MPs were denouncing him. And he had to back down and go on this tirade about how much he supports the seal hunt to try to stave it off. And again, some individual NDP MPs do oppose sealing. And the Green Party, I've already mentioned, they've opposed sealing since, it's supposed to be 2004. The policy change was passed at the convention in Calgary, thanks particularly to the efforts of Green Party members from Humane Society International Canada and IFA, who did a lot of groundwork there. But even within the Green Party, since then there have been frequent and always losing attempts to change the seal hunt policy back to supporting the seal hunt. So every single convention that we've had, I think, since 2004, somebody's put forward a resolution, usually somebody from Newfoundland, somebody who's not really even involved in the party, but is just trying to troll, basically. And it always, gets shut down eventually, but sometimes they get pretty far in the process. You have to be very organized and conscientious about these things, or they might eventually pass it through in, some weak moment. The Green Party issues a frequent press releases opposing seal hunting, so every year there's a press release saying we have to stop it, it's inhumane, there's better economic opportunities. And the Green Party's official policy is to support the end to sealing and replace it with subsidies to other industries to enhance things like sealing ecotourism. But even the Green Party is not invulnerable to sealing industry pressure. So in 2007, Elizabeth May was at one time a member of Sea Shepherd's board. And that was the year that Paul Watson made some choice comments about some sealers who had been tragically killed when their boat capsized. They were being towed by the Coast Guard because I think they'd gotten stuck in some ice. And their boat capsized, and I think 4 of them sadly perished. And Paul Watson, called them barbarians or something, as Paul Watson tends to do. And the sealing industry was outraged, and they noticed that Elizabeth May was on his board and demanded that she step down because she supports calling them barbarians too if she's on the board. So she did, and she said that as a leader of the party, she doesn't think it's appropriate that she's on any boards anymore, and she would step down. So even within the Green Party, there is pressure. Seal Appreciation Day. So I mentioned this earlier, but this is something that is held on Parliament Hill most years now. This is a statement that Fabian Manning, who used to be a Newfoundland MP, now he's a Newfoundland senator appointed by Stephen Harper. This is something that he said. And what you see here, obviously is pretty clear support for sealing. But he also makes a point of talking about both Inuit and non-native peoples who rely on the viable seal trade for their livelihood. And that's something that's interesting. I mentioned earlier there were 2 seal hunts. Aboriginal sealing and commercial sealing. The Conservatives, and all parties really, have made a point of trying to conflate the two. That is their conscious strategy, and that's something that they tried to use to their advantage when the EU stuff was going on. They tried to say, oh, European Union, what you're doing is you're harming the Inuit if you ban sealing. When really there's, a negligible number of seal products from Inuit sealing go to the EU. It's almost all commercial seal hunt products. But they try to capitalize on the Inuit in order to support the cruel and bloody commercial kill. And this is Urfu Payette again, the Liberal senator who's kind of their spokesperson. And she actually, in this comment on the record in the House, she actually makes the claim that she's hunted seals herself. So that's how much she supports the seal hunt. And I'm interested in her last sentence here. People who are attempting to pose their anti-speciest ideology, an essentially humanophobic, messianic movement seeking to convert society to its moral vision of the human-animal relationship.
She's right.
I'll take it.
That's what we're doing, yeah.
Yes. All right, so the final issue I'm going to talk about tonight is the RCMP and muskrat fur hats. This is something that came up recently. This is a muskrat. RCMP have traditionally had these muskrat hats issued to their staff in cold weather situations. Between 3 and 4 muskrat killed to make one single hat. And groups like the Fur Bear Defenders have been asking them to end the use of muskrat for decades. That's been a really long time campaign of theirs. And the RCMP just this fall finally said, yeah, you know what we're going to do? We've conducted an extensive review. We've surveyed our members. we realized that they don't really want these hats anymore, that there are other toques that meet our operational requirements, and that we can save it's going to cost $22 for a toque and it's a $48 hat. So we're going to end the use of fur hats, phase them out, and introduce a new toque policy. Great. So they do that. This is what they say. We've listened to the views of external parties and employees and tested a hat. It's satisfactory. Let's do it. So that's fine. Who do you think this guy is? Does anybody know who this is? This is Robert Sopa. He is a Conservative MP. He stood up in the House of Commons on September 30th. I happened to be there that day, just randomly. I almost never go to the House of Commons in Ottawa. But I was there with my friend Michael Bernard, whose Humane Society International Canada's lobbies on animal issues in Parliament. So he and I were there just watching the show. We were about to leave. And suddenly, this guy stands up and says, Mr. Speaker, the RCMP is going to stop using fur hats. Why does it hate rural and remote communities and thousands of trappers? The fur trade is vital. Radical animal rights activists have as their goal the complete elimination of the fur trade. Oh, yeah. Will the Minister of the Environment tell the House what the government intends to do about this egregious anti-fur decision by the RCMP? So we're both like, ah! And then Leona Labchuk, look what she's wearing. The Minister of Environment. She stands up and looks directly at me and Michael, which I don't know if I imagined or what, but she looks at us and then says, thanks him for the question, and she says, I would like to ensure Canadians that we're taking action to ensure that historic fur hats worn by the RCMP will not be discontinued, despite the efforts of radical animal rights activists. The RCMP decision, which has caused much glee, is being fully overturned. We'll always stand up for the hunters and trappers. So interesting, she's the Minister of Environment. She's commenting on an issue that pertains to the Minister of Public Safety, and she says that he's taking action. The reason that she's doing it is because she's Inuit herself, and they want to try to conflate the issues of the fur trade with Aboriginal issues. It's part of a clear and conscious strategy. So that's what they did, and, we're both kind of like, wow, that was crazy. Why did that happen? And of course it becomes a news story right away. And this is a tweet that I sent out the next day. I said, if you're a Mountie who doesn't want to be forced to wear a fur hat by Leona Labchuk, I'll represent you pro bono in a charter case. And just for your information, we all have the charter right not to have fur imposed on us by Leona Labchuk. So this guy, Jason Tammet, he is the press secretary to the Minister of Public Safety. And he replied to me on Twitter pretty quickly. I don't know who he is, but he saw my tweet. He said, pro bono tip, no one is forced to wear a fur hat. However, our government is ensuring the option is still on the table for the Mounties. So at this point, I started to wonder, are they actually doing anything, or is this all just bluster? Because what the RCMP said, they never said we're just banning fur hats. They said our new hat is a toque. If you want a fur hat, you can still request one and you'll probably get it, but the new standard is a toque. So he's essentially saying the same thing that the RCMP said. So I started to think to myself, like, are they actually doing anything here, or is this just window dressing? And eventually, we realized that they probably didn't do anything. So some access to information requests came back, and Postmedia did a story. And they showed that after she made that announcement, bureaucrats were saying, we don't really think there's any precedent for the minister directing the RCMP and telling them what they have to wear. This just isn't really done. And then there's, other emails that were revealed going back and forth where it looks like they first tried to get the RCMP to comply and drafted some kind of policy, but the policy was confusion. They said the RCMP must maintain their current fur hat policy based on freedom of choice, which is really confusing because there was still freedom of choice. You could still get a fur hat if you wanted to, so what does the minister actually want? So this press secretary guy again says, our government agrees with the RCMP decision to ensure that all members have access to the fur hat, which wasn't really a change. And, eventually it looks like the RCMP is saying that once both hats are available, they'll be issued to members who have a choice as to which hats they want. So It's not really that different from what the RCMP wanted, but the government did manage to turn it into a big thing and show the hunting and trapping industry that they're in their camp. So, I guess what I find interesting about the RCMP fur issue, the fur hat issue, is that it really illustrates the rural and urban divide. So the reason the Conservatives wanted to do that is because they wanted to show their explicit support for the hunting and trapping industry and the fur industry. And they're signaling to those people that you are our people. Farmers, hunters, fishers, we are your party, vote for us. So it's about shoring up support in rural areas. Alright, so we've reached the end now, and as I told you at the beginning, my conclusion is that it really is all about votes. Parties will pick and choose the policies that they'll champion on animal issues based pretty much exclusively on whether they think it's going to win them votes. They care more about seats than good policies. So, even the Green Party's not immune to this. The Green Party's not going to win any seats in Newfoundland, and no illusions of that. It probably makes people within the party freer to say, we don't want the seal hunt. The NDP thinks that they can win seats, and now has some, so they're not going to do anything about that. Same with the Liberals and the Conservatives. And they pander to their bases, like the hunters and trappers for the Conservatives. So if they think that they can either raise donations from them by showing support for their issues, or if they think that they will shore up their votes by supporting hunting and trapping issues, they're happy to do that. And the reason, that they get away with us, like, most people in Canada support protecting animals. That's a consistent theme of public opinion polling. Most people oppose wearing fur. Most people oppose the seal hunt. Most people want to do good things for animals. But the problem is that they don't vote on these issues. People simply don't have animals at the top of mind at the voting booth. And that's essentially what allows these parties to get away with it. So, there's no easy solution. I think proportional representation would go a long way towards solving that. If parties weren't so concerned about winning specific seats in specific regions because they knew that the overall seat count at the end of the election would reflect how people actually voted, I think they would be less terrible, frankly, on animal issues. But, unfortunately, I don't see that coming anytime soon to Canada, maybe within 20 years, but not soon. Ultimately, I think what we all have to do is start showing politicians that if they don't vote on these issues the way we want them to, then we won't vote for them. And the only way to do that is with concerted public campaigns. It's by volunteering for politicians that you do support on election day, and it's by telling ones that you don't support why you don't support them or that you're not going to vote for them. In the United States, groups have done this quite effectively. They've really mobilized around animal issues, and they've unelected people before. If a senator doesn't toe the line on animal issues, they will organize and they will make sure that he or she doesn't win in the next election. And I think that's what we have to start doing here. So, that is it.
Since it's 8:30ish, why don't we just take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back for a discussion, okay? How about that?
Good.
That's everybody. Hey, thanks for coming. Hey, good to see you guys. It's a long way to come. And as far as I can determine, I mean, they mentioned the vote issue, and that was obvious, but the real question is, why would the Inuit do it? And why would the Newfoundlanders confuse this issue with why would they support it so much, since there's only a few hundred sealers? And the answer that I came up with, and maybe you can comment on it, is that it's all about cultural identity for both groups. They're confusing their cultural identity with killing seals. And so essentially it points to the fact that the cultures themselves need to sort of change in some way, but this is why they oppose animal rights activists, because we're seen as challenging their very identity, who they are fundamentally. And that's so serious for them, we're demonized in a sense. And the politicians are just playing that up and following it. So really, I think like if maybe the challenge would be to sort of say, well, to be a good Newfoundlander, you don't have to oppose the seal hunt, right? And is there anybody saying that? Or to be a good Inuit, you don't have to be going around killing a bunch of animals. And there are Aboriginal people who are vegans, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think you've probably hit on something there. I mean, it's obvious to me why the Newfoundlanders would want to say that they're like the Inuits, because people, even animal rights activists, tend to support Aboriginal subsistence use of animals. So it makes sense that they would want to. I'm less clear on why the Inuit would want to be conflated with this group, because it seems to me that it's very out of keeping with our Aboriginal values.
Right.
They're not using the entire animal, they're leaving carcasses on the ice floe. It's a commercial kill for a commercial product, which is fur, which is not what the Inuit traditionally were about. So that part's confusing to me. And I think, frankly, I'm disappointed that many communities have let themselves be used as dupes by the government. And I've seen internal emails where the government has clearly said, like, this is a line from an access to information email that was received that I've used. The government refers to playing the Inuit card. Like, they're just so crass and obvious about it. They're not trying to hide or couch it at all. It's just, it's disappointing.
I mean, and you point to the fact that it is opposed to Aboriginal values. Basically, the seal, the fur trapping and the mass exploitation of animals by colonizers, you know, the end of the buffalo, all of the almost the mass extinction of the beaver, all of this is actually part and parcel of the exploitation of Aboriginal people at the same time. So, in a sense, the Inuit are supporting practices that are exploitative of, you know, destroying nature and are consistent historically with exploiting them as a people. Like that's the mysterious part. You're right, and I think I do have maybe some answer. Well, maybe it's corruption, because I think there were some Inuit people who were paid to go to the EU and do that lobbying. That's the only thing I can imagine.
Yeah, for sure there were. Lots of them went over through various government programs. I think the government did a good job of convincing them that they will be in receipt of benefits if they go over there and do this. And perhaps some of them were actually just duped into believing that the EU ban would attack them when there was a clear exemption for Inuit products.
Right.
It was never designed to target Inuit sealing products. So perhaps some of them were just duped by the federal government's efforts despite this exemption.
Or it could be that they just hate animal rights activists so much. This is like, because I had a debate with an Aboriginal activist who has extreme hatred for animal rights. So I mean, but again, through the cultural, I don't know. Like, I think it's a good question anyway.
And that makes me think of the idea of tactics and strategy. If this is a barrier, and we know it is, we know that Newfoundlanders don't like to be being called brutal or savage or inherently inhumane to animals. We know they don't like that. It makes me think about what kind of strategies we use as a movement to try to end the seal hunt and whether those are effective. And I actually think that some of the worst things that have been done to obstruct progress on getting rid of the seal hunt would be done by PETA, who's gone over there and don't work on the issue most of the time, but they send people from the States, they send Pamela Anderson and Sam Simon, the Simpsons creator, high-profile celebrities into Newfoundland to try to arrange a buyout. Whereas other groups are working with communities, they're actually making inroads to sealing communities, and they're saying to sealers, listen, this is a dying industry, it's on its way out anyway, how can we work together to transition? Without sort of the name-calling and the stuff that invokes a cultural identity that I think really gets people's backs up.
So the cultural identity part of that, the opposition would be coming from somebody who's, they're seeing there's an outsider coming and telling them what to do, as opposed to them solving the problem themselves.
And I think the more of an outsider that you bring in, like somebody from PETA from the States, is about as outsider as you can get.
Right.
And you've got people like Rebecca Aldworth, who's led the fight against the seal hunt in Canada for the last few decades. She's a Newfoundlander. She's from there. Paul Watson is from New Brunswick. There are people there who I think can speak with more authority and that are perceived less as outsiders than others, and it's something that the movement has to be conscious of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is anything? Do you ever hear from the pro-sealing people that they're sick of the inconsistency. Look at what's targeted prominently in the public eye and filters up sometimes in the House of Commons. It's ceiling, it's foie gras, it's horse slaughter, it's shark fin soup. These are all culturally specific practices that target small constituencies. And arguably, like, what's going on in the ice floes is not worse than what's going on, in the trapping community. What's going on with the trapping for every Canada goose jack is far worse. These animals are not killed very quickly at all. They're left to suffer for days sometimes, and then they're beaten to death up. It sounds brutally. Everyone's wearing those around their collars. And the foie gras. We can, like on our Cruelty meter or something, like decide whether the foie gras is, a 98.6, and the calves are being skinned alive probably every Monday morning at Ryder Regency. Whether that's 93.2 or something, but come on. I sometimes, I want to wear an anti-fur patch too, but I sometimes feel like it should just be, don't wear animals. Stop wearing animals. And that we're doing ourselves a disservice maybe. I'm not saying you're doing this, but just looking at the seal issues, maybe think about this quite clearly, that we've really got to adopt a kind of a radical unified front of what really needs to change. And of course the legislation, which couldn't get through, was trying to do a little bit of that, like really address the fundamental issues about cruelty to apply to all animals, including, especially to farm animals, who are the billions. However, hundreds of thousands of seals they're killing each year. Every day at this chicken slaughterhouse they're doing maybe 150,000 birds. I'm sure thousands of them being scalded alive every day here at St. Clair and Kiel. So it's. I don't know if they've attacked us on the inconsistency front, but I always feel it kind of lurking there, that like they can sneer at us and call us, biased idiots or something, because we're attacking sealing and not thinking about the leather on our shoes or...
Well, they called the European Union hypocritical. That was their line on the EU. The EU is so hypocritical. They're over there eating their foie gras and their horse meat, and they're telling us we can't have our seal hunt. And they're not wrong.
Yeah,
it is an inconsistency. It's not fundamentally different.
Yeah, Peter McKay's comment is not idiotic in a sense. It's coming from an idiotic place probably, but in a sense, he's like calling out that inconsistency. I guess that was one example that came through there of someone calling that out.
I don't know if it's the inconsistency to go, because it happens with humans as well. So just because you are trying to deal with child abuse, and you think that is extremely important. I work in adult mental health. People don't care a lot about adults with mental health issues in terms of funding them and dealing with them, because the media portrays everyone as it's totally not true. The violence rate is nothing like what people are saying. It's no more than the average population. But just by supporting, if somebody has for whatever reason decided that women's causes or children's causes are important, and they're not being consistent. If they're not opposed to the others as well. You know what I'm saying? Like there are gateway things to things. Even in our field, children's mental health is the gateway to adult mental health. We know that. Yeah. People, it's the homelessness. Children's homelessness or youth homelessness is the gateway to adult homelessness. And I have found that people can get a dog or a dolphin or a seal, and I just hope as I push them through that chamber that they'll end up with the rooster, chicken, I see rooster all the time, chicken, cow, pig, right? Because my concern with the seal thing is not even the external, the government. My concern was when they did the sealsies, they were the selfies, social media, it wasn't government oriented, it was individual people.
Oh, that was totally a PR firm orchestrated though.
Was that?
Yeah.
I was curious about that.
Oh, PR firms are behind all those things. Same with the hashtag selfie, the farmer selfie, where they're taking pictures of their animals. Like a happy cow in a nice green field. It's like, okay, are you going to take a picture of the next day when you take that cow to the slaughterhouse? Of course not. It's just a public.
Apparently, if the Harvard government, and I saw an article on this, paid a firm $75,000 to get some trolls to go online to oppose anybody who supported the seal hunt on YouTube and things like that. Like comments under the Star articles and stuff. Like, wow.
They spend a lot of money actually tracking people's Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts as well. If you've got a public account and they can see it, they spend millions of dollars a year on that stuff and millions of dollars responding.
Wow.
The attempts at public relations manipulation are vast and far-reaching.
I wanted to add, earlier I asked, who's buying the seal fur? I mean, if Canadians by and large, or the status quo, disagree with seal hunting, which I really strongly do disagree with, LB, Newfoundland, who's buying fur? Is it Europe? And what of the European Union? Are they still somewhat, against it, or are they allowing?
Or they banned it.
They never really banned it entirely, or they have?
They have.
Some
There's a very narrow exemption for Inuit seal products, but it's not really fashion, it's more like traditional craft kind of stuff.
Okay, fine. So, I mean, years ago, Maclean's, I think, had an article about the seal hunt. And, I mean, the only solution to Newfoundland, or any place in the world, in fact, is to buy them out, to propose an option for them. So this is a big, this is really what we have to look at. We have to, people have to appeal to the government and or, other countries requesting they refuse to wear and purchase seal products, and our own communities to propose an alternative source of revenue for these people. They will say, it has been in our family for generations and so on and so forth. Well, of course it has. So, I mean, let's just face it, times have changed. Compassion has no boundaries, and it should not be governed socioeconomically. I mean, socioeconomic should not be a variable on how a person thinks. And I bet deep down, these seal hunters have dogs and cats they allegedly love and so on, are really compassionate people. But it's just so entrenched and ingrained in their community, in their social dispositions and their personalities now. They need an outlet, really,
So do you have a question for Camille?
Okay. Do you agree with me?
Well, first of all, on the issue of bans and encouraging other countries not to purchase seal products, that's absolutely been 100% the strategy of animal rights groups as opposed to seal hunt. So IFA, HSI, I used to go over and lobby the European Union when I worked at HSI. That was the thing that they were working on. And they're working on other countries too, and then by and large, they've been very effective in getting bans on those products. Including Russia,
you mentioned that.
Yeah.
In fact, in the slideshow.
Yeah, so that's been a really, really key component of it. And then the other component has been doing work here at home. So you shut down the markets internationally, you drive down the pelt prices so it's not financially worthwhile to go out there and kill the seals. Then you've got a stronger case at home for saying, hey, you're not making money doing this anyway, you're just wasting your gas and you're wasting your time for a couple $100 a couple times a year or once a year in the spring. Why don't we give you some money to stop doing this? So you strengthen the case for a buyout. And buyouts are nothing new. They happen all the time in Canadian industries that can't survive anymore. And it's easy to replace the sealing industry with ecotourism. Already in the Magdalen Islands, which is a small, they're part of Quebec, but they're just north of PEI in the middle of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They do a lot of sealing, but they also do a lot of seal ecotourism, where they take people out in helicopters to see seals on the ice floes, like I have the privilege of doing. It's one of the coolest things that anyone will ever experience, and they already make more money doing the ecotourism than they ever did sealing. So it's profitable, there's an alternative model there. We just have to shift the conversation and get to that point.
But maybe is it possible that the sealers, because of the cultural tradition, they view it as some sort of, some kind of pseudo-religious cultural thing going on, like a rite of passage, and you're not a man until you kill your first seal, and
the men are like, a couple weeks in the spring, get to go sealing, smoke on the boat all day, smoke and drink, get away from the wife. It's like, it is a cultural phenomenon for certain coastal communities in Newfoundland.
There was one more thing, which was I heard that the Gail Shi was trying to open up the Chinese market, and for that she got the pie in the face thing. But did she succeed? with that, opening up Canadian market?
No, they've been trying for years to open up China, and so far it hasn't been successful.
Okay.
And interestingly, there's a lot of Chinese animal advocates now. The animal rights movement in China is apparently really taking off. It's becoming the next best thing, or the next big thing, I should say. And people there are very opposed to Canada trying to shun its projects of cruel commercial hunt on China. And apparently they've made some pretty good inroads there.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Where does the fur go? So if the
Yeah.
EU's not buying it and Canadians aren't buying it,
It's
China's
greenhouse.
not buying it.
Well, China's buying some of it. They are buying some of it, but not, in the volume that Canada wants right now. I don't even. Denmark buys a lot of it. There's sealing in Denmark.
so it's all exported to.
Or Norway, I should say. Maybe it's Norway. Yeah, it's all exported. It's a little bit used domestically. Like, I know some people in Newfoundland have seal fur vests. There was a guy who was the Newfoundland lobbyist on the Hill for a while who had a full-length seal fur coat. So somebody produces these products and presumably you can buy them somewhere, but I don't see people wearing them. And, I was mentioning earlier, they have to really modify the appearance to get people to even buy this stuff. So when you see seal fur that's actually for sale, before the European ban, I would see photos of what it was like in Europe in terms of what they were selling. Really modified, dyed, cut in little strips. Like, it didn't look like a seal at all. It just looked like another fur product. So I think that's a function of people not having an appetite for it, and I'm trying to convince them to buy it in other ways.
What about the levels of subsidization, both for that industry and all other animal industries? Is there any way that can be leveraged as a way to tackle those industries in terms of fairness of that subsidization?
Well, it should be. I think it should be. I mean, the seal hunt, the economic argument for ending it has always been a really strong one. We're spending millions, tens of millions of our taxpayers' dollars to subsidize this industry every year, far more than it actually generates for the economy. It's basically a glorified welfare program. And you could say that, I think, at certain times of, the cycle about farming products as well, meat products. There's always pork buyouts, right? Like, the agriculture industry is also really heavily subsidized. So, yeah, I mean, it should be a really strong argument, but again, I guess it's difficult for the government to be motivated to act on it when people just don't vote on those issues. So you can say, well, we're wasting taxpayers' dollars, and you can tell everybody in Canada that the government's wasting your money on X, Y, or Z. If it doesn't affect them at the ballot box, it's just so difficult to get them to actually move on it.
Isn't the Canadian agriculture killing the loony?
Is it?
All the loony birds?
All killing the loony. Yeah, killing everyone.
What's going on with the animal justice law reform, and is that what role would that play in the history of the death of animal rights laws, law reform?
Oh, yeah. Well, we're kind of monitoring a number of things, mostly at the provincial level right now. There's the marine land mammal standards not marine land specifically, but only just marine land that has marine mammals in Ontario. But they're introducing new standards and they're banning the future keeping of orcas, so that's something we're probably going to be working on, helping get those standards in place. At the federal level, frankly, there's not much going on. We were consulting on a new NDP cruelty bill, which they want to put forward, trying to make up for that botched bill, I think, that they really screwed up on, and the one that had these exemptions for all the industries. They now want to prepare this new bill, and they've been working with some animal groups to draft the language, and as it stands, it seems like it's pretty good. But again, there's, at this point, 8 months left before a federal election, so the bill's not going anywhere. But it might be something for the next session of Parliament to consider.
Has anybody brought up to the NDP that their opposition to animal rights is inconsistent with their stance for social justice?
I think people have brought that up internally with the NDP, and I've got a lot of friends who support the NDP.
With Marilyn Shirley? Is that what you said? Sorry.
Oh, no, I said that I think people have brought that up internally.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Internally.
there are some people within the NDP, not Marilyn Shirley.
Yeah.
There are some people in that party who really do care about animal issues, like, a number of people. They just nominated a candidate, actually, in my riding, Jennifer Hallett, who's a vegetarian and cares about issues and has been out to animal rights fundraisers before. And they've got MPs sitting in the House right now who I consider to be very, very good on animal issues. So there's people there, but they don't win out when the discussion comes to things like the seal hunt, where the regional interests are what always become victorious, because it comes down to seats. No one in Toronto is going to win their seat based on animal issues, but people in Newfoundland might lose their seats based on animal issues. And when a party is so protective of every single seat that they have, the animals always lose.
You brought up the failure of, even though there's a lot of social justice stuff in Quebec, especially in Montreal, I guess, despite that, it's very backward in its welfare laws. And what I heard from Quebec animal rights activists when I was visiting them recently was that it's because of the rural tradition is very agricultural and therefore anti-animal welfare. It's a cultural issue, apparently. And so they're almost hostile to animal rights, they were saying, and especially the rural people. And it's tied to that identity issue again, but so, but then the irony of the fact that they're for social justice, largely, yeah.
It just goes to show that you can't place animal issues anywhere on the spectrum. You'd think that the left might be more receptive, and they probably are as a group. You could probably make more headway with left-leaning people than right-leaning people. But not always, right? Sometimes the social justice types are the last ones that want to be receptive to that message. I've got tons of union friends who really like unions and want workers' rights, but couldn't care less about animals and just kind of laugh when you bring it up.
And in fact, we'll do this. What they'll do is when you raise it, they'll say that you're a racist. They'll use social justice language to attack your stance for social justice for non-human animals.
Sure, or, why are you going after farm workers? The farm workers are just one cog in this bad industrial system as well, and they're pushing on that basis.
But we did hear, we have a friend whose partner is a former union leader, and what she had said was, so here's the other side, was that when they had reached, when they reached out to animal rights groups, because animal rights protesters were protesting, they thought there was a link. And those groups said, we don't want anything to do with what you're doing, right? So they're like, if you support us, we will support you. So she said, and she lives in Niagara. So there's a lot of marine land kind of things going on in that area. And they're very anti-marine land. And many people within the union are. But she said, because we were talking about, they came over and this is sort of this conversation because they're kind of learning a little bit more and, that kind of thing. And recognizing that, what role can we play? Because, when you were doing your presentation, Ontario is, it's not really more urban. It just feels more urban because of where I live, but...
Yeah, yeah, me too.
But what would be the predominant place to put our energy, politically, in Ontario? So Newfoundland is, sales or whatever. I mean, every place has got something. What should Ontarians? I know there's bears.
Yeah, bears, frankly, these days, I'm finding municipal councils to be a really attractive option. Excuse me. They're much easier to accomplish anything because there's no parties, so you don't have to do any work with the party hierarchy to get them to even agree to let their MPs talk about issues. It's just individual councillors, many of whom actually do care about the issues. They don't have party bosses telling them what to think, and they've got more freedom. And then the process for moving something through councils is much more simple than trying to move a bill through the House of Commons, which can take years, especially if it's not a government bill. So these days, I'm finding municipal councils to be one of those great areas where you can focus on. Also, they've got a lot of jurisdiction over animals. They can deal with exotic animal issues. They can ban certain practices, probably, within the municipalities. Circuses and zoos. They have a lot of control and can do a lot of things. They ban cat and dog sales in a lot of situations. Yeah.
They had shark finning or shark fin quotas.
Before they got their hands slapped down by the court.
That was a shame.
Yeah. But it's nice, and if the city does something first, even if it's just a small town, others are likely to jump on the bandwagon and go from there.
So that's where we can put some of our,
Yeah, I think there's lots of potential. And it's easy to get media attention locally on issues.
City councilors.
Yeah.
You know, a few years ago, there was a deer shot in Hyde Park.
Oh, I remember that.
I just happened to go there and I met the women that allegedly stayed with that deer for hours and indicate that the one police officer who attended after 3 hours was off shift, had a replacement have come or arrived who gave the authority to shoot the deer. But through that ordeal, it seemed that that deer was suffering escape myopia. And that one of the women, who was not a nurse, but worked in a massage, so she was a sports medicine masseuse or something. She claimed that because it was lactating, the deer, that it was just like very excited and she felt that it would be all right. And the residents in that area, in Hyde Park, came and they were all offering to call their veterinarians and everything. And in fact, apparently allegedly they did get through to the Toronto Zoo and the veterinarian was unavailable and other veterinarians were unavailable. That people were putting together their money and offering to have something done. Well, I think what happened eventually when the replacement police officer arrived, he agreed to shoot the deer. So, you know, sheer havoc broke loose. I thereafter the fact, contacted Suzanne Doucette's office. I wrote her, and Peggy Nash's office, because I'm in the jurisdiction of Parkdale, Hyde Park. I'm more in Parkdale. And this is well before Toronto Pig Safe and my associations, but I wasn't even meet or anything at the time. But, you know, I will have you know that Suzanne Doucette and Peggy Nash wrote me that personally, email, and they stated that they were very affected by the incidents. They had many of the residents of Parkdale and Hyde Park write them, and they wanted to, she claimed, arrange a group, like an on-call pro bono group of veterinarians that were willing to be contacted when there was an incident, in particular, involving wildlife as deers that have no safety or do they have any, you know, protection in incidences where they are involved. Allegedly, the Ontario Provincial Police are directed to shoot them. So I just want to ask you, and maybe you can think of this and everyone else, whether there, today as I speak with you now, however many years after the fact, is there a veterinarian's on-call list that was apparently to be mustered, so veterinarians would perhaps be willing to come down to an incident as such, to look, you know, to work with an animal rather than it just
Can we
being
just let
shot?
Camille answer that?
Yeah, I have no idea. I couldn't tell you. I remember the deer being shot, but I don't know anything
Isn't that a
about it.
wonderful idea? Like,
Yeah, it's a great idea. Peggy Nash, she's one of the sponsors of an animal cruelty bill. She's good on animal stuff. Yeah.
It's actually against the law to bring a wild animal into a vet practice. They can get in a lot of trouble for that. So the process is for deer, it gets, and any large animal, it's not exactly clear, but any animal that can fit in a car, Toronto Animal Services, and there's lots of volunteer drivers from the Toronto Wildlife Centre, they are supposed to be called every time, and they will do everything they can to get them to the vet at Toronto Wildlife Centre, which unfortunately is moving up to Rouge River, very hard to get to. It is in Downsview Park now. But that's the process for a wild animal situation. When it's a deer or a coyote, anything that could freak out or like cause public any kind of safety issues, then the police are allowed to
Why don't we steer it back to the seal issue and Canadian legislation on animals and Camille's talk, okay?
It was about local issues.
well, the impact of local occurrences.
I'm wondering about, you talked about municipal councils, and the opportunity there. So I'm trying to see practically what can we do. And I have to be honest, well, how people stand on the animal issues is like absolutely unknown, right? It's not something that comes out easy. I mean, in our area, you know, maybe I'm not researching properly because I'm probably not.
You guys in Kitchener?
Yeah.
Maybe it's one. Somebody out there is trying to get cat and dog sales banned in pet stores.
Yes.
A woman contacted me about it recently. I think we might write a letter in support. But yeah, it's interesting because there's no party platform for any of them.
Yes,
really
that's what I'm saying. So like you and just like you showed, you can have an individual, particularly when it's a municipal council, you don't know, a person who's right out there for you on some issues, and then is totally not there on the animal issues. So it's that kind of, because I think we could have a lot of power if we had that ability to sort of educate people and make those kind of, have those conversations with people and kind of stir them up and get them excited. But it's hard to do when you don't know. I mean, we live in sausage place, Oktoberfest. It's hard. Like it's hard to find people.
But the nice thing is that you can just call them and ask them, and they will often answer the phone themselves because it's small enough that you won't have to go through their staff room.
Yes.
So you've got an opportunity to build a relationship with them, and sometimes they haven't even thought about these issues and they're not on the radar at all, and you might be their first introduction to it.
It might be a good strategy to find issues that are kind of slam dunk issues. You mention it to them, they go, yeah, of course that's wrong, yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And then get everybody to do it, and just get that little step ahead, and then find another one that's, okay, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And just
Build momentum. Here's an example, the shark fin ban. The first time a municipality passed a shark fin ban was Brantford, Ontario. There aren't even any Chinese food restaurants in Brantford. No shark fin going
Not
on.
even the Chinese and
so it's easy. Whatever, we'll do it, sure.
Yeah, and it was a conscious strategy on the part of the people who wanted to bring municipal bans to Ontario, was to start there. You start there, they show that they can do it, other municipalities are like, good
Brantford already
idea.
did it,
Yeah.
Home away Gretzky.
You never played for the Sharks. Bring hockey in.
So speaking of hockey, do you know about the Ron McLean thing in the Don? It was Ron McLean who ate the seal burger, and Don Cherry
Called him a barbarian.
called him a barbarian.
Don Cherry called him a barbarian.
Yes, it's very
But then
strange.
backpedaled, like,
That's interesting.
Yeah, very strange. He was kind of doing it the way he said it was kind of in a joking way, like, oh, you're eating a baby seal, like, what are you, a barbarian?
Oh, that's real.
kind of like, people, do you realize that you have the option of not being outraged every time Don Cherry opens his mouth?
Yes. It's more outraged by what he wears than what he does.
Was this very recent or?
It was like 2 days ago or something, 2 days ago.
I'll check that out.
Don Cherry's a strange bedfellow with.
I know.
What's interesting is
But it
that
sounded like it was tongue in cheek though, he was being sarcastic.
It's just trying to be controversial, as Don Cherry does.
Yeah, that's what he
I was like, you're
does.
gonna be called a barbarian. Right, so what he's saying is not I'm calling you a barbarian.
Yeah,
So the controversy was just
Yeah.
people misinterpreting the sarcasm.
yeah, they don't realize that that's
Yeah,
what
he's being
he does.
sarcastic.
yeah.
Yeah, he after that stated, I support the seal hunt, like, don't get me wrong, I'm joking.
He's making fun of
I'm gonna
people.
club one every time the Sharks score a goal.
See, there was public pressure. Even Don Cherry had to bow to the pressure of people from Newfoundland and elsewhere when he made an offhand comment.
I think it's weirder than just like the Newfoundland. There's something weird going on here, which like you've made clear to me that there's something weird going on with the seal thing. I think, and can't help but think of like the symbology of evil and empire, and that. I mean, empires always thrive on the sacrifice of the innocent, and that's the inner logic of it, and it's and of evil, and it goes back to last week when Keith Akers talked about the temple of Jerusalem being the center of sacrifice and numbers people aren't aware of, and there's something else going on as Canada aspires to not empire, but to make itself friendly to, like, for example, American empire. It's like people are tripping over themselves to make it clear that they're not on the side of the innocent. It seems so of the weak. It's a cheap way of showing you're strong by saying, coded in terms of being on the side of laborers and traditional culture of saying, ultimately we're not in favor of weakness.
It's pseudo-fascist.
If there's a strong, when I look at a scene, I identify the strong and the weak, and I'm not.
And might makes right. Might makes right is fascism. That's the underlying philosophy.
But it's their slam dunk issue, right? I mean, the public, it's been allowed to become their issue that they know is their slam dunk issue. I mean, on the other side, right? It's like as long as we link the word Aboriginal to seal hunt, we will win, regardless of the stats. Like look, the stats, I keep hearing them through animal rights circles, and they never see them in the public venue anywhere. The Aboriginal seal hunt and how small it is, and less than 1,000 or whatever. I never see those anywhere. Like I think those numbers itself are something that people just have absolutely no idea about, right?
Absolutely no idea. Even people who should know, like, does anyone know who Tanya Tagak is?
Oh, I tweeted her after she was on Radio 1 and said, the Inuit seal hunt is not the...
Yes.
And she retweeted my tweets. Even she was conflating the two.
Yeah, they don't know at all.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Do you think the RCMP will change the name to RCDMP? Royal Canadian Dismounted Police?
You should write them a letter and say
Demuscrated police.
It sounds like it's easier to go to Taiji and see the dolphin killings. But you want to go see them to observe than it is the seal hunt.
Yeah, you can't go to the seal hunt unless you have $50,000.
You can't just go to
Well, that's because it's offshore, isn't it? If it was on the coastline.
Like, how do they define the area?
Well,
They can't
it's probably so here's what you do. Depending, and the seal hunt, the location of it is not constant because it depends on where the ice is. So the seals just move around with the ice because they live on the ice. So you kind of have an idea of where the seal herd is and where it's drifting based on ice flow patterns. And there's some Environment Canada data that might help you with that. But unless you get coordinates from a secret source at the DFO, the Fisheries Department, you are stuck flying around in what we call a spotter plane. So you rent a small little plane and try to fly around the Gulf of St. Lawrence and find the seals. It's damn near impossible, right? Like they're this big, they're little black specks on ice, and the ice, the flows are shifting around, so there's speckles of water that can look like seals. Like it's really difficult to do. So you spend thousands of dollars on a spotter plane to find them, and then you have to spend thousands of dollars on helicopters, rental, fuel, pilots, and equipment, of course, to get back out there to see them once sealing begins or whatever. So it's not a cheap proposition. I think the easiest we ever had it was one year where it was off the coast of Cape Breton. So we stayed in Sydney and had these Zodiac boats in Sydney. And we managed to actually find a place that was ice-free to launch them against all odds. And so we zoomed out to where the ice was. And the ice was kind of shifting around, so there was enough room to boat between them. And that was, probably the easiest we ever had. But even then it was difficult. And there were sealing boats there that tried to ram us. Like, it's just not an easy thing to do.
You need someone undercover.
But you can't do that because you need somebody basically from Newfoundland.
You can vet ourselves in Newfoundland. Sealing.
Go get married to a Newfoundlander now, have children, and then
That time all the ice would have melted anyway.
good point.
What's the government's, or the sealers, what's their, official excuse for not having, do they say it's a safety thing? For not allowing people out there,
Yeah, the government says that it's a safety issue for the sealers, so they're trying to work, and if there's eyes on them, they might slip. They say that protesters harass the sealers, which the opposite is actually true. Protesters have never interfered, and they're not protesters, they're observers. They've never interfered in the sealing industry. But the seal hunters have repeatedly beat up people that I know and threatened them, and sometimes the Coast Guard will come along and lay charges, bogus charges for getting closer than you're supposed to. So even if you have a permit to be within the zone of the sealing itself, so that you can observe it, you still can't be more than, or less than 10 meters away from a sealer who's working. So if I'm clubbing a seal right here, you have to keep a 10-meter distance between us, and if you get within that 10-meter zone, then they can charge you. And so they have charged people in the past, and the charges were dismissed because they were baloney. Yeah, so.
How does the rest of the world view Canada, like, not only on that issue, but the animal welfare laws must be pretty bad here?
Yeah, I think it is pretty bad. The WISPA, or WH World Animal Protection as they now know, just released a pretty comprehensive report classifying all countries in terms of their animal protection laws, and we got a D-, I think, or a D. It was not a good grade.
Do you know what China got?
I don't remember what China got.
But in terms of GA countries, it's not good, and on the environment or animals or anything.
No, we're a pariah on a whole bunch of issues, and Canada, the seal hunt included. I think that one is something we're especially known for around the world, and have been for 30, 40 years now, and people don't like it.
I think America is doing that with proposition bills that have been introduced, like in California.
Yeah.
Gestation rates and trying to ban foie gras.
We think that we're this progressive country when it comes to everything, and we're better than the States. We are so far behind the States on animal issues, it isn't even funny. Like you said, California, they've got all these crops coming down in farming practices.
Thank you so much.
Individual states are doing great things. Some of them are doing bad things too. But in Canada, like, what has happened recently, legislatively for animals? Basically nothing in a long time. There's been a couple of provincial amendments, but on a national level, nothing useful in decades. Ontario still doesn't even regulate zoos. We don't have a zoo licensing system. There's no exotic animal legislation. Like, it's just dismal up here.
Instead of going out to the seal hunt, why don't we figure out where the Ontario trap lines are and go take some organized hikes with a big stick and disarm some traps, get rid of some traps.
Well, as your lawyer, Paul, I must advise you that would be illegal.
Especially with this recording.
Just cut that part out, okay?
But there's always something.
You guys are going to keep me in business for a while.
The horror is always local. There's always something close by that's just as bad as what's going on in Tachi.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. For sure. It would be great to get footage of trap lines.
Is there like more acceptance for other kinds of hunting and trapping than the seal hunt, like at on a national public opinion level?
Probably. That's a good question.
It feels like it because of that CBC, that family, that really annoying family, and they're like teaching their children.
No, I didn't watch that. I quit.
Oh, it's horrible. And they're, and it's healthy, and our children are outdoors, and they're peeling frozen animals off the tree that they've trapped, and literally for money, right? Of course. Like they go back to their little cabin there, and the little boy's like, "Can I skin it? Can I?" And the comments are just. It reminds me of speaking about soldiers. Like there's almost there's a holy thing. Like the soldiers and now farmers, family farmers, and now the trappers.
These saints who are just on God's word.
If the world goes, we're all going to need to know how to kill squirrels on trees. Right?
Yeah.
That's the thinking.
Living close to the land.
That's right.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, most of the public opinion polls I've seen have put trapping and sealing support in about the same category, which is relatively low. Fur farming is, most people support a fur farming ban. I think about 75% of Canadians support a ban on fur farming. I don't know if that would be less for trapping. I don't know if that question was asked.
And the other 1 in 4.
Percent walking around with the coat.
I was just going to say the other 1 in 4 where you can't.
I don't think
More than 1 in 4.
I don't think a lot of people know. No, I think people, there's staff I have, and I can't walk up to them because that just creates a whole other thing.
Well, there was somebody.
And I know that they don't know.
in this class.
I know that they have absolutely no clue because I heard them talk about things. And people buy it, look at clothing, and they buy it, and there's this assumption because for the longest time there was no fur out there. Or there was very little. Faux fur was so popular for many years, and there's this assumption that fur is so incredibly expensive, or that it's a coat, and this kind of. I know a lot of people don't know. And then
They would never buy a fur coat.
Yeah, they would never buy a fur coat. Yeah.
They just don't realize the trim is actually fur. Tons of people think it's fur.
Yeah.
I went to Harry Rosen before Christmas and talked to the staff there, the head guy who came up with us in the Canada Goose Jack. They have a huge section and was like asking about coyotes and dogs and he was like, well, I think they're following some humane practices. I think on some of the newer farms they're shaving the animal. Like he thought he was selling Canada Goose jackets and Harry Rosen and the fur was shaved off like this.
And glued back on.
The same with like Angora, people think that it's kind of, from the...
They just brush them.
Yeah, when you see that video, I think that's probably one of the worst videos I've ever seen. And people have no clue, right?
Yeah,
They don't even know what Angora is.
There's a willful denial. It's not that they don't know, they don't want to know. And so there's a willful ignorance as opposed to an actual ignorance, you see? There's somewhat of a difference there. Yeah. Anyway, you know what? It's 9:30. I guess we have time for one more question. Any more silent group over here?
Not to single anyone out.
Anybody, any last one?
I just have another question about Canada Goose. I've noticed that it's become like a political company. I've noticed a lot of politicians have their codes. I actually got in a debate with 20 Clement on his Instagram about his Canada Goose code, which he defended first by saying it's legal, so I'm allowed to do it. And then he said it's what keeps me most warm and comfy, so I'm going to wear it. And then said there are hunters and trappers in his riding that he supports. That was like his last line of defense, which I thought was interesting. He definitely doesn't have anybody running his Instagram, it's him. Oh yeah. And he's doing a bad job of
He's hilarious. He likes everything I ever post on Instagram. Me too. He's just like, does he have a bot that does it for him? It's just incredible. One man
can do all that. But yeah, I've noticed the Justin Trudeau's family wearing all the fur and everything, I've noticed that TV reporters are always wearing the Canada Goose. Is that, have you lobbied to the government?
Yeah, and actually there was a slide in this, which I kind of skipped over, actually, because the woman here had a Canada Goose jacket. I didn't want to single her out. But there was a slide of Stephen Harper visiting Canada Goose's facility that I was going to point to and say how bad it was. It's... they pledge their support to this great Canadian company that's doing good things, it's local,
and they give their coats away to celebrities. It's definitely they claim that they don't advertise like a traditional company. That's one of their claims that they don't put money into advertising. It's a homegrown, it's a word of mouth. But they send newscasters, they send companies free coats.
It's owned by Bain Capital now, majority. It's so Bain Capital, the epitome of American capitalist empire. Yeah, it's this very predatory capitalist enterprise. It's actually, so Canada Goose is a front for American empire now, and it's vacuuming life out of Canada.
Yeah. Well, wildlife supports also Canada Goose hunting, trapping, and all that.
Yeah.
And so many people
Or they agree to be supported by.
Yes, that's right.
I'm going to file a consumer protection. Don't tell anyone about this yet, but I'm going to file a consumer protection complaint against Canada Goose shortly for falsely claiming, in my view, that their jackets are particularly warm because of the fur trim. They keep saying, oh yeah, the fur is so important to protect the delicate skin around your face, because sometimes even the urban environments can feel like the coldest places on Earth. And they cite this, they've got this researcher in Michigan who sort of says that fur, if it's on a jacket, can help your face, but they don't really distinguish between fake fur and real fur. So I'm going to say that they're misleading people.
So I think that we as a whole are much more experienced with grassroots activism, and that makes us, I think, the kind of people tend to have contempt for the political process. In fact, I recall hearing Paul talk about how I theorized it was not the legislative people who actually rule, but the staff, right? And so So, I mean, your idea of working on municipal politics is great. I was wondering if you had any other recommendations about we could get started to work on.
Yeah, I do have a really important one, and you can all take advantage of this. It's the opportunity is going to come up. So I said earlier that politicians are invulnerable, basically, to public pressure because they don't feel that anyone's going to vote on those issues. And one thing we have to do to turn that around is show them that people do vote on those issues, and show them that we can help them get elected. So a politician who's running for office, whether they're an incumbent or whether they're trying to knock off an incumbent or whether it's an open seat, the way you win elections is by knocking on doors and having a lot of volunteers. If animal advocates get together in groups and go to those politicians who support our issues and say, Jenny has done this, I've gone with her. We flyered for Shelley Carroll, who's a counselor who's really great on animal issues and supported the development.
And Labchuk was the organisation that sort of enabled that.
Exactly. Labchuk has done a really effective job of reaching out to municipal counselors and developing relationships and helping them get reelected. So they work for Glenn DeBaramaker, who's another great guy in animal issues. And I think Michelle Berardinetti as well, a little bit, who's also being good on animal issues. And that's what we have to do, whether it's municipal, but also definitely federal and provincial. Show up to those people's campaigns. Make a point of wearing whatever affiliation you have as a button on your sweater and say, hey, I'm here from such and such a group. I support these issues. Do you support them? Great, I'm going to knock on doors for you, and I'll give you, 10 hours between now and election day to go canvassing with you. Show them that you can help them get elected. And I don't want to say that you'll have them in your pocket forever, but they're going to feel like they owe you, and they're going to be much more likely to do good things if they get in there. And it's, strength in numbers. We can all do that in one individual riding, and if everyone across the country gets together and chooses enough ridings, we can make a real difference doing that kind of thing. So.
That's a perfect way to end that.
Well, thank you.